story of Sentinel begins with a pragmatic need. When Australia answered the Mother Nation's call to arms in World War II, it had exactly 8 tanks in its inventory. Well, I kind of call them tanks. In actuality, they're a Mark 6A light, so yeah, technically tank, but with a 5.0 and a time that even the 37mm was starting to become a little bit underwhelming. Calling them tank is a bit generous. In any case, operations overseas did confirm to the Australians the wisdom of having their own tanks instead of having to rely on attachments from other Commonwealth units, such as the British Matildas that were used in a very successful attack on Bardia, which then resulted in the Australians capturing Italian M13s, there's actually one around the corner here, with big white kangaroos on the side, which made an interesting photograph, good models, not very practical for a professional military, however. There was also the looming threat from Japan. So pretty much tanks were needed. Where does Australia get them? Well, this brings us to the next problem. Australia was not a tank-producing country. In fact, it had virtually no heavy industry whatsoever. Now, it was manufacturing the LPs, the local patterns, which were a variant of the Bren carrier, the universal carrier. But that was simply a matter of thin armor plate, commercially available engines, commercially available transmissions, to an already extant design, slightly modified for local needs. A tank, especially a cruiser, was another kettle of fish entirely. Now, it would take your typical tank-producing country about 2 years to go from we need a tank to actually, okay, approved for service. The US Army's head of research and development and ordnance branch just before World War II estimated about 2 years for a major end item to go from start to finish. And if you think about it, other countries are more or less the same. The famous Tiger, for example, was a 1938 project, didn't see service till 42. Possibly one of the fastest was T-34, but even that is most of 2 years, at least if you start back in the A-20 days. Australia, starting from scratch, even when it comes down to the industry to build the tanks in the first place. Problem. Now, the other solution, of course, is just to buy tanks from somebody else. Well, here's your next problem. By the time the War Cabinet in Australia was given a request for 200 cruiser tanks, it was July 1940. And incidentally, just to make matters worse, that number got exponentially bigger over time. 1940 was not perhaps the best year for the British Army. There was a small incident in France, and all of a sudden the British are absolutely desperate for tanks. They're churning them out as fast as they can, about one a day, to replace the losses from France and also to meet the operational needs in North Africa. So for the Australians, they had none. The Americans were the next best bet. America, can we buy some of your tech? Well, oh God, you got M2 mediums? Never mind. Now, they were working on the M3 medium and the M3 light, but they were not yet ready for production. So in the short term, Australia was on her own. This thus brings us to Australian Cruiser Mk1, commonly known as Sentinel. Now, after much trial and tribulation, the first prototype was accepted for testing around July-August 1942. We have come to the Barrington Tank Museum. In the UK, they have the only remaining complete, accessible Mk1 in the world. Now, there is another complete Mk1 in Puckapunyal, there's runs, but the Australian military won't let us film it. Now, one of the nice things about doing this show is I get to show you features of tanks that you know about, but you maybe not know about the features, so the lesser known details. Well, you got sort of a double whammy with this one. This is a tank that almost nobody knows anything about anyway, so hopefully you'll find it somewhat interesting. As if you don't find the other ones interesting to begin with, right? Anyway, standard process, exterior, interior, and then we close. Let's get started. So as we start to tour the exterior Sentinel, immediately you can see a philosophical divergence between the Australians and their mentors in the UK. They were having a look at the A13. They decided that it was insufficiently armored. As a result, they made two decisions. Firstly, that this tank, the Australian one, have armor worthy of the name armor. even if this came at the cost of some speed and mobility. The other decision that they made was that the hull should be cast. And it's something of a ballsy decision because at the time no tank had ever been built with a cast hull. As a result, Sentinel is generally considered to be the first cast hull tank. The other interesting feature is that due to shortages of materials, the Australians had to develop their own form of steel. They didn't have any nickel. However, their metallurgists had figured out by that point how to make weapons-grade steel without nickel, and they'd been building 2-pounder cannons without it for a while. The armor itself, as you can see, nicely sloped, good 2 to 2.5 inches thick, which compares very favorably with anything else that anybody was driving around in at the time. Other features on the front. So of course you have the headlights, one on each side. They feed in through the side here. Just behind, there's a little plate engraved into the hull, and it tells you 3 things. It tells you the tank number, which is 49. It tells you the hull number, which is 56. And it tells you the turret number, which is 18A. Why 18A, I have no idea, but that's what it is. This means that this is one of the sort of mid to later production tanks. But in general terms, there's not much difference between them anyway. You have armored visors for the driver and hull gunner. You have the rather prominent armored housing for the machine gun, which everybody keeps talking about. It's kind of the most famous thing about Sentinel is the shape of the armored housing. I said, look, this is a perfectly good tank. There's more to this tank than just the armored housing. The axle housing at the front. It's basically the transmission housing that you'd find on an American tank, for example, except instead of being bolted along the top, it is actually bolted frontwards, shall we say, to the hull. But for repair and maintenance purposes, under the bolts, pull out the axle housing, you'll find. As a point to note, the numbers at the front of the axle housing, the AH84, that means axle housing number 84. It's not the tank hull number at all. And of course, BK, Bradford and Kennel, they were the guys that actually came up with casting for the tank. Similarly, the 53 on the turret front there on the mantlet, that's the mantlet casting number. It's not the turret casting number. Far side, more visors, another headlight, and then you get to the side of the tank. As you come around to the right-hand side, towards the front, you can see the viewport and the only marking on the tank. Now, most viewports will have a little slit, so even when it's closed, you can still see something out. Not so in this case. So if you want to look to the right and you don't want to turn your complete periscope at the front there to the right, it does rotate, then you have to actually open up the viewport on the side. Now, I mentioned that the number was the only marking on the tank. This was true because it was never really a fielded tank, unlike a lot of other vehicles, which would have a unit marking on the front. And that's how you would tell on Australian tanks. You looked at the unit marking and you had to know what the Australian unit markings were. The other thing is that most of the Australian vehicles were painted in the Australian standard camouflage scheme, which was a two-tone of olive green and light tan. Now, looking at this one, comparing it with other Australian vehicles I've seen around the world, the brown appears to be wrong. It's a little bit too brown, not enough light tan. However, when these guys were repainting this vehicle, I can only assume that since they were across the world from paint chips and only have black and white photographs to work from, that they can probably be excused for making 1 or 2 small errors. It wouldn't be the first time. The other famous example is the blue on the Matildas that you see on various musea. The contour scheme, no, it wasn't really blue. But hey, you didn't know that at the time and nobody is around to tell you were wrong. So that's it for the upper side here. We're going to come back to it. But now, my favorite part, the tracks. Coming down to the running gear, 2 types of track were available. They were not interchangeable. The steel track was single pin, had 129 links per side, had a 4-inch pitch, and required a sprocket wheel of 20 teeth. Now, the alternative, and the more common one, was this rubber track, 13-tooth sprocket wheel, so if you changed tracks, you had to change your wheel. a 6-inch pitch, and 86 links per side. Now, the track may look somewhat familiar. In fact, it's basically the M3 Medium's track. And by reputation, because Sentinel was based on the M3 Medium, and so really the only thing that they kept was the track and one or two of the suspension components. So the track itself, rubber, both sides. The end connectors are exactly the same as you'd find on an M3 or an early M4. They also worked as the center guides. You could get grousers that you would attach to the tracks as well for additional traction. The suspension units, bogies 3 per side. Like your typical bogie unit, it is bolted to the hull, with the advantage that it takes no space inside the tank. You have lots of room for all your equipment, ammo, whatever else you want to put inside. And also, of course, it's very easy to replace a damaged suspension unit. You just unbolt it. Downside, mobility, probably not as good as a proper independent system. The bolts are big, but there's only 4 of them. Now, if you compare it with, say, the M3 Medium, it's got 16 bolts holding on a single bogie, which seems reasonable. This is just 4, but the bogie does kind of angle underneath the hull, so the weight of the hull rests partially on the bogie as well as the 4 bolts. Still, I can only imagine if you slide, let's say, into an obstacle going down a hill, the lateral force on the bogie, if there's only 4 bolts holding it in place, it's probably asking for trouble. The bogies themselves, they come in 2 types. Most of them have the central return roller. Some later vehicles had a return roller that was offset more to the rear. You saw this again with the American tanks. The suspension is a horizontal volute suspension system. I realize it doesn't look like it, but it is. I think what throws people off is that there is a coil spring at the back. It's a dampener spring, and people think that makes it a Horseman. As we move further back along the hull side, we start to see a couple of the cool features of Sentinel. And pun is intended, because of course Australia is not a cold place. I was in Cairns a couple of weeks ago, 40-something degrees and godly humidity. And I can only imagine it gets worse if you go to places like Papua New Guinea or the deserts of North Africa. Tanks, of course, they're basically ovens. If it's hot outside, it's hotter inside. I'm curious, if it's cold outside, it's colder inside. Don't know why. But what they've done is from here all the way to the back of the hull, this is sort of an umbrella housing for vents that go all the way to the rear. You can also see 2, they may be chutes here because they're not on the far side of this turret, but these are also slots that go all the way up inside. They could be for the 303 ammunition shell casings coming out in the canvas belt. We'll find out when we get inside. But there are cooling vents in the turret as well. There are some towards the rear, and there appears to be one up at the top right corner as well, which I initially thought was a periscope mounting until I realized it was on basically every Sentinel I saw. Then I get to the Sponson Box. There's nothing really remarkable about these. They're a nice size for all your various Pioneer tools or tank repair equipment. They're held in place by simple latches, latch forward, loosen, lift it up. I can't open these up though because somebody has placed a screw and bolt, so I need a couple of pliers to undo it. You could, of course, if you were completely paranoid, use padlocks to secure your equipment, if you were afraid that your buddy might take it from your tank. But then again, is it really paranoia if they are out to get you? It's not commonly known, but the word STEAL is actually an Army acronym. It goes back many, many years. It stands for supplies taken in excess of authorized listing. And being an official Army acronym, it is thus fair game. So here you are, if you should become a tanker, word of advice, keep an eye on your equipment. Just before we go back to the idler wheel, quick point to note, somebody is going to ask, what is this oval thing for in the hull sides? I know they will ask because I have asked myself, what is this oval thing for in the hull sides? And the answer is, I haven't the faintest clue. Initially you would think it was some sort of an access port or an escape hatch. It's not, it's welded in place. So hopefully we'll find out when we go inside in our voyage of discovery, but until then, I haven't the faintest. All right, so everybody's favorite question, how do you tension the track on a Sentinel? It's actually a little bit different on this tank than most. Most tanks, the idler wheel itself is forward or backwards, maybe by an offset idler arm. In this case, the entire idler mounting will slide forwards and backwards. You can see that there are 4 slots which run on bolts. They're basically guide bolts, and that's the size of that slot shows you just how far forwards or backwards the idler mounting will go. To actually conduct the tensioning is pretty simple. You just pull out the cotter pin, remove the locking plate, use your really big wrench to screw backwards and forwards, put the locking plate back on, put your cotter pin back on, and you're done. Another characteristic feature of Sentinel is the long sloping engine deck. It doesn't have very much on it, just access ports. This was required by the power plant, which was a marvel of mechanical complexity, rivaled only by the A57 multibanks you found on a couple of American mediums. Now, this again goes back to the problem of Australian manufacturing capability. Remember that Australia was not known for its heavy industry. They figured that in order to get a tank like this to move at a reasonable clip, they needed about 400 horsepower to do it, and nothing like that had ever been built in Australia. The solution, therefore, was to find engines from abroad. The first choice of engine was going to be the Guberson radial diesel. Diesel engine, you'd find it maybe in the M3 light tank. However, production capacity was not available. Guberson were willing to give the dies and jigs, but they didn't have any tooling. So that kind of fell by the wayside. The second choice was a twin GM671, as you would eventually find on the M4A2, on the M10 gun motor carriage, and on Valentine's. However, again, production capacity was not available. The next choice is said, well, how about the Pratt & Whitney single Wasp? It's an aircraft engine, really powerful. And yeah, by the way, we have the license to build these things here in Australia for aircraft manufacturing. Great idea. The problem was that the War Department decided that producing aircraft was more important than producing tanks, at least when it came to the engines. So all Pratt & Whitney Wasp production went to Australian aircraft manufacturing. So yet again, the Australian tank manufacturing says, well, what the devil do we do now? At this point, they're starting to scrape the bottom of the barrel. Their solution is the Cadillac. It is a V8, 346 cubic inch plant, cranks out a whopping 110 horsepower. Not very powerful, but it was available. So how do you get a 25-ton tank to move at any reasonable clip with a 110 horsepower engine? Easy, you get 3 of them. And so there are 3 engines in the tank, 1 at the rear, 2 further forward, all meeting together. The 3 outputs mesh in a transfer box, a Perry transfer box. And that is why you have such a long engine deck. Other feature on the engine deck, you do see the external fuel stowage. It is quite simply external fuel stowage. It's not connected to the fuel system in any way, shape, or form. You can also see that the ventilation system does continue underneath the hull side. A couple of spare track blocks and some towing eyes. Not much else on the rear of the tank. Right, so we've come up onto the back of the engine deck, and the first point to note is getting these access panels off was an activity fraught with peril, because the thing is sloped like this. It's a somewhat glossy paint, and you just have this tendency of sliding off. So imagine doing this in the rain, for example. My cameraman is completely kitted out with all this mountaineering safety gear you can imagine. I, of course, am not, and health and safety are over there going, oh my God. So there are 3 engines in a cloverleaf configuration, 2 forward and 1 to the back. All 3 of them have their own propeller shafts. They meet in a single transfer case, which is located under the turret about this far forward. From there, it is a single propeller shaft forward to the transmission. As you can imagine, with 3 engines, which are all water-cooled, there's a lot of coolant required, 23 gallons filled in 2 different positions. surrounding the 3 engines are the fuel tanks. They tally 140 imperial gallons. There are 5 individual tanks, but only 1 place to actually fill it, which is the cap that I'm screwing now. And to tell just how much fuel you have left is a good old-fashioned dipstick, which actually reads up to 146. So I guess it gave you a couple spare. The manual is not specific as to how far you can actually get on 140 gallons of fuel. Of course, being 3 engines, you have 3 times the maintenance requirements. So there are 3 dipsticks, there are 3 oil fillers. So case in point, if you look at the rear engine here, this is the oil filler, and the dipstick is located further forward. We kind of pulled it half out so I can actually get at it. It's way over there, let's push it down a little bit here. So if you want to do any serious maintenance, undo all the bolts that are all the way around the engine deck, lift off, remove the engine deck, set it aside. Now the 3 engines, the transfer box, the cooling system, the fuel tanks, they're all mounted together on a sled. So you would then take your crane and lift the entire sled, the entire pack comes out. So it's one of the first examples of a contained pack, shall we say. Obviously it doesn't have the transmission that's further forward. But it does allow relatively quick access to everything once you've cleared everything out of the way. That is it for the engine deck. Next we're going to go forward onto the turret and then inside for part 2. Alright, so take 3 because I screwed up the first 2. God damn shit. Australia was not a tank producing company. Damn it. Like all bogies, they are bolted to the hull. This means that you have, well, not like all bogies, because I bet you some are welded. There's somebody somewhere is going to say there is a welded bogie system. I don't know of any off the top of my head, but somebody's going to tell me. 3, 2, wake up. We, of course, must keep the blooper reels. They tend to be the most popular part of the show. It's kind of depressing.